Here's a question for you. What's Australia's most important zoonotic disease? That is, a disease spread from animals to humans. The answer is Q fever. Hundreds of people contract it every year. Some even die from it. It also costs industry millions of dollars in lost work hours and disability compensation. And while those who've heard of Q fever tend to pigeonhole it as a disease of abattoir workers, research obtained by Landline that's yet to be publicly released reveals it's farmers who should also seriously consider being vaccinated.
And a very good morning to you and welcome to the North and West Report. I'm Kendall Jackson. Great to have your company. You're listening to 639 ABC. It's 20 minutes to 7.
Every weekday morning you can find Kendall Jackson sitting behind the microphone at the ABC studio in Port Pirie in South Australia.
Later. But first today, this grain growing season is likely to produce...
But in November last year, this regional reporter had to leave her usual round of interviews and go home because she felt so ill.
Well, the initial symptoms, I had a headache, and I thought this is perhaps what a migraine was because I'd never had a migraine before. And then it led on to, like really severe sweats where I was completely saturated and had to change my nightwear. And I was really hot, and then I was really cold. And that's when I decided that I needed to go to the doctor and that something, possibly could be majorly wrong with me. I thought I was going completely insane.
Kendall wasn't going mad. She'd contracted Q fever. But she didn't know that for another month or so, until she coincidentally was reporting on an outbreak of the disease.
And I was talking to people who had had Q fever, and they were talking about their symptoms and saying about this sweating and the headaches and how they were feeling. And I was like, wow, that's exactly how I felt back a few weeks ago. So I rang my doctor and said to him, is there a possibility that I may have had Q fever? And he said, definitely.
As it turns out, 22 people contracted Q fever from the Jamestown sale yards here in the mid-north of South Australia in October last year. Kendall Jackson only passed through briefly on that dry and dusty day. It highlights that Q fever is not just an abattoir disease, it's a rural disease, and it can be a very debilitating one too. Auctioneers, shearers, truckies, farmers, even rural journalists. Anyone who comes into contact with stock is vulnerable to Q fever. In fact, only half the 600 or so Australians who contract the disease each year catch it while working in an abattoir.
It's very much been seen as a red meat processing problem, but as the statistics are showing, it's not. So yeah, I think in terms of as not just the industry, but in especially rural communities, I think it's very important.
I spent half an hour at the sale yards, and that's what just amazed me, because I went there, I knew exactly who I was going to speak with and interview when I was there, and I met them at this one place, interviewed them for 5-10 minutes, and then I left. So, if anyone was going to contract Q fever, I wouldn't have thought it was me, but it was.
By the 1930s, Australia was in the grip of depression, but we'd established ourselves as a good farming nation, riding on the sheep's back. It was around this time that there was an outbreak of an unknown disease at the Cannon Hill Abattoir in Brisbane. A government pathologist, a man named Ted Derrick, identified the disease and isolated it in guinea pigs before naming it Q fever. The Q standing for query.
This was a really very big Australian discovery, and very shortly afterwards a similar organism was isolated in the Bitterroot Valley in Montana in the United States, and it was only a bit later that they realised they were one and the same organism. It was really quite an interesting story. And after that, it was found in the Mediterranean war campaigns during the war, and it gradually realised that this is a worldwide infection, and the only country which is said to be free, and probably is New Zealand.
Professor Barry Marmion has made a career of studying Q fever since the 1950s and has had scores of papers published in scientific journals. While he's too humble to admit it, he's contributed more to the current understanding and prevention of the disease than any other Australian.
Mainly it's an airborne infection, and the organism is shed in large numbers when the animal gives birth. It's present in the placenta, and the handling of that and the movement of the fetus and so on spreads the organism in droplets in the air, and people who are in close contact are infected.
In the 1980s, an outbreak of Q fever at an Adelaide Hills abattoir prompted Professor Marmion and his research team to develop a vaccine against the disease.
Union representatives were on hand to observe procedures as the head of the research team, Professor Barry Marmion, volunteered a blood sample and then had a skin test administered.
Hi, Brooke, come in.
Hello, Sandra.
Hop up on the bed here.
Okay, thank you.
The two-step process developed by Professor Marmion and an American colleague, Dr Dick Ormsby, along with the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories in Melbourne, first involves a blood test
Don't jump or just prick.
and a skin
Make
test
sure this goes between the layers of the skin.
to determine whether the patient has been exposed to Q
And we're
fever.
looking to see if you've got any cellular immunity where white blood cells
As a
recognise-
journalist often reporting from farms and sale yards, I wouldn't have been surprised if I had been exposed.
Okay, we'll see you in a week's time.
Hi, Prue, come in.
Hi again, Sandra.
Take a seat.
Thanks.
Now, I've got your blood results here. Q fever serology, no antibodies detected. So no antibodies in your blood. I just need to check your arm. So which arm did we do the
That
skin
one.
test in? Okay, so there's nothing there. I can't feel anything. So you've not been exposed to Q fever. We can give you the vaccination. Okay.
It's a whole cell vaccine, more refined than a cruder version from the 1950s.
Okay. Put a finger on there. That's it. Finished.
Are there likely to be any side effects from the vaccination?
You may get a local reaction at the site of the injection, a bit of redness, tenderness, swelling at the site, and occasionally your immune system kicking in can make your temperature go up, feel a bit achy and unwell, maybe headachy, feverish. Just take some Panadol.
And how long before we're covered for Q fever?
About 2 weeks.
It was hoped that all meat workers would embrace being vaccinated against this nasty disease. But despite the efforts of the vaccine producers, the rate of uptake was slow, particularly in the smaller abattoirs. So 5 years ago, the federal government sunk $18 million into a national Q fever management plan. It meant free vaccination for people involved in the meat industry, including sheep, dairy and beef cattle farmers. Goats are particularly bad for harbouring Q fever. The management plan finished in some states at the end of last month, while the program will continue in Queensland, Victoria and South Australia for at least another year. Groups like Meat and Livestock Australia say the battle against Q fever is far from over. More funding and understanding is needed.
It's been very important for us to understand the disease and how it presents, and one of the most important things is, as Q fever presents very much like the symptoms of a common cold, for a long time it was misdiagnosed.
Despite everything, and it's now over 60 years since Derek described this in the first instance, people still are fairly ignorant about Q fever.
Professor Marmion is now 85 years old. He's retired from his research work, but is often still consulted for his knowledge of this most underestimated illness.
There's such a strong case for continuing vaccination, which I don't doubt the abattoirs will want to do.
It's long been understood that about 2% of Q fever sufferers will end up with heart valve damage, which can prove fatal. But what hasn't been identified until quite recently is a sinister long-term condition. Professor Marmion has called it post-Q fever fatigue syndrome.
We found this when we were doing the vaccine trials in the abattoirs here in Australia, South Australia, during the 80s, and the people said they'd had Q fever, they hadn't got over it, and they were lethargic and they really couldn't cope with the exercise which they normally achieved easily and so on. And there are very few localizing physical signs except this general disturbance of various body systems. So that probably occurs about 8 to 10% of cases, of the acute cases go on to this.
I'm interested in a lot of things. I guess motor cars has always been my first and foremost interest and hobby. We've done up quite a few cars over the years, I suppose, but over the last few, things have been very slow.
Dean Searp used to be a meat inspector with what is now referred to as AQUIS. But 8 years ago, his life changed dramatically.
I was working on the slaughter floor inspecting animals and felt quite unstable on my feet, sort of dizzy in fact. And one of the other inspectors noticed me not looking too well and suggested I go down and let the nurse of the abattoir check me out as far as see what's wrong. And I did that, and she said my blood pressure was extremely low.
This father of two had contracted Q fever. The trouble is, it's never really gone away.
Oh, the first year or so, I was very scared. I didn't like to go out. We lived out in the country, 10k out of town. And I didn't like to go out because I was scared to come home because his sleeps were so deep that I thought he was dead or just would never wake up. And that was very scary. And he said it felt like he was melting into the earth when he started to go into these sleeps. He said, just feels like I'm melting into the earth.
So was that just for you, just like a complete collapse?
Yes, it was. It was sort of, in a way, it was almost a relief because of the headaches and perhaps the aching joints, and at times with the congestion, you just wanted to be, well, I suppose your body itself just began to shut down. And yet there was always something there that, I'm going to get over this,
But it looked like somebody pulled the plug out.
Mm-hmm.
Just pulled the plug out and he just...
Yeah.
Gone.
Dean Searp is now on a raft of tablets, some prescribed by his doctor, others are vitamins and minerals that a naturopath has advised him to take. They make him feel a little bit better. There was a time when he couldn't even remember his own phone number. Now there are days when he feels well enough to tackle a few tasks. As much as he would like to be able to work, to put aside money for retirement, he can't. He never knows when he'll feel well enough.
After a battle with the insurance company, he receives Comcare workers' compensation, amounting to about 3/4 of his old base wage. Perhaps it's this infinite liability associated with Q fever which makes meat industry types nervous about discussing it.
Landline had teed up an interview with one of Australia's biggest meat processors, but the company has since reneged because it didn't want to, and I quote here, become the target of common law claims. And compensation for Q fever certainly has the potential to blow out. A report published 2 years ago estimated the 322 Q fever claims each year cost a total of around $1.3 million. But the chronic cases, those long-term ones, have resulted in payouts as high as $1 million each. It's big money.
As we consult with our stakeholders who are processors, we understand their concerns, and their concerns are the workers' compensation costs because they are quite crippling in this industry. And so we hear that is an issue, and the research and development that we do is driven by the processors. So again, it's looking at what the risks are in the industry, and if Q fever is seen as a large risk, then we will continue to see it as a priority for research and development funds.
For many abattoirs now, there is a policy of no jab, no job, and it seems to be paying off. A report yet to be made public by the Federal Health Department claims Q fever notification declined in 2003 to the lowest recorded level since 1999. Queensland and northern New South Wales are still hotspots, with a few outbreaks in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. In abattoirs, vaccinating has been a great success. But among farmers, there is still real ignorance of the disease and its drastic consequences. More than 85,000 doses of the Q-Vax have been administered over the course of the 5-year management plan, with one of the main obstacles being the lack of understanding of Q fever in the ever-changing rural medical community.
Do you think, Dean, that this could go undiagnosed in people?
Very much so, yes. Well, I suppose there's probably a lot of farmers and people like that who have got, they're suffering from headaches and extreme tiredness and aching joints for no real reason, and they just can't put their finger on it, and they're feeling very irritable, and this is very common, of course, of Q fever, and they go to their doctor, and the doctor tells them they've got the flu.
Do you think that there's a chance that people may have had Q fever and might even be suffering from the chronic effects of Q fever and not know that that's what it is?
Oh yes, I think there is. I mean, it's particularly with the fatigue syndrome.
So is there room for more research, do you feel, on Q fever and the post-Q fever
Well,
syndrome?
naturally I would say that, wouldn't I? Yes, I think there is. I mean, I think that we badly need, for instance, a decent diagnostic test for post-Q fever fatigue syndrome, which would enable us to sort the sheep from the goats, if I can mix the metaphors.
One thing is known about Q fever: it can flare up after pregnancy. After all, the organism causing it is found in the placenta of animals. And that's a concern for ABC reporter Kendall Jackson. She became pregnant only a few weeks after contracting the disease, and her third child is due at the end of August.
Initially, it was a very big worry. I had 2 weeks where I felt very stressed out about being pregnant and having had the disease. There has never been anybody in South Australia, as far as my knowledge and what my doctor has told me, who has been pregnant with Q fever.
But she's philosophical about any possible long-term consequences.
I'm going to have 3 children under 3, so I probably won't be able to tell if I've got chronic fatigue or whether it's just my lifestyle, even if I do get it.